Nosso planeta vai fazer 68 anos sem uma grande guerra, um dos mais longos períodos pacíficos da história, mas não há festivais para comemorar a paz e a ordem mundial. Há zonas de conflitos agudos na Síria, Líbia, Afeganistão, Iraque e Ucrânia, e crônicos entre Israel e Palestina. A União Europeia está ameaçada pelas crescentes dúvidas sobre o euro e pela instabilidade do líder russo. As grandes potências estão em perigosos cursos de colisões armadas, econômicas, ecológicas, políticas e religiosas. O diplomata mais influente do nosso tempo, Henry Kissinger, vê o principal líder, Estados Unidos, sem interesse em liderar e sem uma visão de uma nova ordem mundial. O inglês Mark Mazower, professor de História na Universidade de Columbia, em Nova York, é conhecido pelos seus livros sobre história europeia, Grécia e países bálticos. No seu último livro, Governando o Mundo, a história de uma ideia, ele conta sobre os esforços e fracassos de criar leis e organizações internacionais para manter o mundo em ordem e em paz. When you look at Europe today, what do you see in terms of international law?
I see one of the most successful political projects of the post-war era, the European Union, that worked in the sense that it was established to make war impossible between France and Germany, and I think war is now impossible between France and Germany. This achievement now has to justify itself anew for a new generation, and that is proving difficult for two reasons. One is in the headlines right now, the expansion of the Union eastwards very peacefully, and the claim of the Union to speak for Europe imposes upon the Union certain expectations in a situation such as we have in the Ukraine at the moment, or in the Crimea, which it is not very well equipped to meet. And the second challenge of the European Union is the product of its own policies, austerity. And those policies have created tremendous imbalances, or better, they've accentuated imbalances between the north and the south of Europe that were there. And they have precipitated a great erosion of support for the European Union.
And who is to blame for the problems we have today? Politicians, diplomats, the rich, the financial institutions?
Well, as anybody in a relationship knows, when you ask who is to blame, there's never one answer. So I don't think there's a single answer to that question. If I had to start, I would say that a large part of the blame rests with the politicians and the political class, because they bought into a very narrow conception of politics in sometime in the 1990s that believed that globalization, and in particular the globalization of finance, was going to solve all problems. And so when the financial crisis hit, all they could think about was how to save the financial system. And all the other aspects that used to be considered part of the politician's duty, to think about the good of society, to think about the poor, to think about redistribution, took second place for them to the immediate problem of shoring up the financial system. And that's, I think, the single biggest problem. Now, I don't think the politicians are the only ones to blame, because the politicians in the wealthy countries failed to convince their voters that something else was needed. So there was a lack of solidarity across Europe. It turned out in the crisis that the European Union had failed to create a deep enough sense of solidarity across countries. So that's the bigger failure. That's a failure of the Union. That's a failure of people themselves. You can't blame it all on everybody else. It's a failure of the Europeans to learn from their own past.
Your book, Governing the World, A History of an Idea. By the way, I have seen other titles for the book, The Rise and Fall of an Idea, but it's a history of an idea. You see three significant moments in the last 200 years. One is 1815, the other is after the First World War, and then the 70s. Can you give us, explain why did you divide the last 200 years like that?
So I was interested in when people began to see international affairs as something that was governable. Mm-hmm. And I think that dates from the defeat of Napoleon. And it starts as a European project amongst European states. So that anybody interested in the management of international affairs must go back to 1815 and the aftermath of 1815 and the ways in which some powerful European states decided that they could govern Europe. Now, broadly speaking, international government in practice in the 19th century is the system of alliances amongst states that these victorious powers set up in 1815. They call it the Concert of Europe. Mm-hmm. And it's identified as a conservative project. It's identified as something that serves the interests of emperors and kings and powerful states. And so you get a variety of thinkers who want to think alternatives. And they want to think radical alternatives that are democratic and liberal and are going to lead the world in a new direction and a more peaceful direction. For most of the 19th century, those remain blueprints on paper. Mm-hmm. But the importance of the First World War is that the real victor of the First World War, the United States, is led by a man, President Woodrow Wilson, who is in many ways the heir to these radical visions of how the world should be run.
By the way, you mentioned several times the importance of an Italian activist, Mazzini.
Well, yes.
That we don't know much about it. So Wilson actually paid a visit to him.
Yes.
So
Giuseppe Mazzini is known to every Italian school kid as the great nationalist of the 19th century, as the man who wrote about why an Italian nation should exist at a time when it didn't. But what we've also started to understand is that Mazzini's conception of nationalism was connected to a very powerful vision of internationalism. In other words, he thought that the world would only be at peace and that states would only achieve peace amongst each other when states were run by their own peoples, not by emperors and kings. Woodrow Wilson, as you say, was a great admirer of Mazzini, and he saw things the same way. He thought that if the League of Nations could be built and could bring national self-determination to every people, and all the empires of the 19th century collapsed, with the possible exception of the British Empire, then the world would be at peace. And he believed that almost messianically. And that's why he saw himself as this great prophet, this great religious leader, who was finally going to banish war forever.
But you don't see Wilson as the father of the League of Nations.
So what I tried to suggest was this is one very powerful force behind the League of Nations. There would be no League of Nations without Woodrow Wilson. However, there is another less idealistic force behind the League of Nations, which is represented by a group of thinkers in the British Empire who have much tougher, more hard-nosed reasons for wanting to create an international organization. It's the only way they can bind together the destinies of the British Empire and the United States.
So the Concert of Europe was created to protect the monarchies.
Yes.
The League of Nations was created to protect the winners of the First War.
Partly.
The interests of
partly. You have to explain two things with an organization like the League of Nations or the UN. One is, why would small powers join if it's obvious that it's set up in the interests of big powers? And the other thing you have to explain is, why would big powers join if they can do things by themselves and be unconstrained? You have to be able to explain both of those. Both of those are conundrums.
So it generated the UN.
Yes.
When did it show signs? When was the most evident sign that it was not working as it was supposed to?
again, the question is, what was it supposed to do? If you think about the original purpose of the UN, it worked. The original purpose of the UN was to make sure that the United States and the Soviet Union continued to cooperate. The Americans and the Russians wanted to make sure that they continued their wartime cooperation into the peace and never went to war with one another. And they set up the United Nations on such terms that they could both join and they could both be sure that it could never be used against them by the other. It worked. Soviet Union and the United States never went to war directly with one another. That was a considerable achievement. So when we say that the UN failed, what we think about is not that original idea. We think of lots of other things. We might think about bringing democracy and self-determination to the world. Well, arguably the UN succeeded there too. It was in the lifetime of the UN that 170 plus countries got their independence. That's an achievement. Now, the UN didn't stop war. The UN didn't stop poverty. The UN didn't do many things that we wish it had done. But maybe the problem is with us, not with the UN.
The third date you put on your 200 years history is the 70s?
Yeah.
And what is that?
So in the 1970s, I think, something very interesting happens. As a result of the Vietnam War, America's overwhelming dominance in the world is challenged for the first time. And for the first time by the mid-1970s, you have 100 plus countries that were colonies that now have independence. We call them, or we used to call them, the Third World. We don't use that term so much. And so we have a triangle of power. United States, the European community, as it then was, economic community, that's the second leg, and the Third World. And these all have their own visions of what the UN should be. The UN had really been driven by the United States up until that time because it had done many of the things the United States wanted. But the Third World countries in the 70s start to challenge this.
Right.
And they want a UN that will be much more responsive to their own concerns. And here I'm thinking of national development of national economies, protecting infant industries, allowing welfare states, all the things that the Americans and the British had enjoyed in their own time, they want to enjoy in the 1970s and the 1980s. And the argument in the 1970s is whether the UN will become a kind of international agency that allows for the growth of these social democratic welfare states or not. And what I suggest is that that struggle is very decisively answered, no it won't, when the Europeans decide that their relationship with America is the most important thing for them, and the Americans go down what we will call the path of neoliberalism.
Yeah.
So that's why I think the 70s is important. It changes the character of what the UN did.
Do you think the idea of international government is dead, or it's in coma, or what's happening?
Well, I think the idea of government is dead. I think the idea of government is dead because sometime about 10 or 20 years ago, people started talking about governance instead. And governance is this kind of incredibly wishy-washy term that means sometimes I'll listen to businessmen, and sometimes I'll listen to civil society, meaning NGOs, and sometimes I will listen to my constituents. But it represents a vision of the weakness of the public sector.
So no one is really governing.
So no one is really governing in the way that people understood the terms in the 40s, domestically or internationally. That's more surprising domestically because they could govern if they wanted to.
You wrote a book about Hitler's empire. Any similarities when Hitler talk about the greater Germany and the new Russia?
That's an interesting question. Well, Greater Germany was a 19th century project. Hitler inherited the 19th century project, and it was the project of bringing all Germans into a single state. When you listen to Putin's language, justifying his policy in the Crimea, where he talks about Mother Russia as the attraction for all Russians. Yeah, absolutely. That's 19th century language, no question about it. So that kind of territorial nationalism, the nationalism that's obsessed with borders and boundaries and land, comes straight out of that 19th century milieu. And Putin's language is of a piece with that.
Historians, diplomats, commentators, many of them seem to get the impression that they don't know what Putin wants. You have a feeling about it? What does he want?
So I think that Western media focus on Putin. Mm-hmm. They do this for a very simple reason, that underlying the world view of the societies we live in is the idea that problems are caused by dictators. And so you focus on the figure of the dictator to understand the problem. Russia is a relatively illiberal polity compared with the United States, so everybody focuses on the new Tsar, on Putin. I'm not sure that what Putin is doing is particularly unpopular in Russia.
No,
everything that
Russia,
I read suggests that it's pretty popular. And therefore to focus on Putin as though the secret of this is what does Putin want, may actually be to fall into this trap where you always fixate on the dictator. The problem is, what do Russians want?
Behind you on this side, right behind, it's full of books about Greece. You wrote some of them. Mm-hmm. To the left is about the Balkans, two of other specialties of yours besides Europe. How is Greece doing right now?
Terrible.
Terrible.
Terrible. I mean, if you know the country, I've been going to the country for many years, to see a country, but of course this has happened in parts of South America too. You see a country where the entire society disintegrates as a result of an austerity program that is mandated from outside. It's a terrible thing to see, because even when you know that there need to be changes, very often what you find is that the price of those changes is not paid by the people who should have paid it. The price of the changes is borne by people who will not work again, or in the case of Greece, by a generation of young people who may not find jobs. So you have huge rate of youth unemployment, over 50%, and high increase in the suicide rate. And we can discuss the causes of the Greek crisis and who's to blame for that, but you cannot argue with the fact that there's massive social suffering in Greece at the moment. So I find that very distressing.
Now, the Balkans is the other gallery of books here, and there is a big one that says Balkan Tragedy. How tragic is it right now? I mean, well, some countries are doing more or less. Huh?
They're doing a lot better than you would have said 20 years ago, when Yugoslavia had torn itself apart by war. And so the fact that you don't have fighting, that's an achievement. The fact that you don't have war, that's an achievement. After that, it's really very, very localized. Now, I think in some ways, tremendous things are happening intellectually, culturally.
Like
in the
what?
field,
like
so
what?
in the field I know about history. Okay, I don't know about an awful lot of other fields. The field of history, if you go to Bulgaria, there's a whole new generation of young historians writing fantastic books on Bulgarian history. The archives opened up, people want to read them, it's very exciting. Same thing is starting to happen in other countries. The newspapers don't write about that, but that's real and very important. On the other hand, economically, all of these countries have been operating in the same very difficult environment that everybody's been operating for the last few years. And they have an added problem, which is very high levels of organized crime. And there are parts of the Balkans where it's very difficult to distinguish between organized crime networks and political networks. They overlap. So you can't say that economically there's been some kind of terrific success story. But politically, given the history of the last few years, I think the fact that you have relative stability, that you have a climate which is going to allow for investment in tourism, in other industries. That's progress.
Economists, some say that Europe is coming out of it, but many say that Europe is not going to come out of this thing, and the recovery will go down. What is your view on this? I know you are not an economist.
Well, I'm not an economist, and I'm not a forecaster, but I do think it depends what you mean by recovery. Mm-hmm. If you mean by recovery that people start forgetting to worry about the stability of the banks, they stop thinking about runs on the banking system, then we're probably coming into a recovery. Even in Greece, which, as I said to you, is suffering very significantly, the banking system looks much stronger than it did 2 years ago, so that has to be an achievement. My worry is that you define recovery in such a way that it's compatible with very high levels of employment, very high levels of youth unemployment. And then what kind of recovery is that? That's a very short-term recovery.
The extreme right seems to be doing very well in Europe, even in England.
Yes.
How dangerous is it?
I think that it's dangerous because there are some countries where the extreme right will do very well electorally, may even enter power. And then it's not at all clear what people do about that. We've already had that problem in Austria in the 1990s, for instance, with Haider's Freedom Party. So one problem is that the extreme right-wing parties may do much better than they've ever done before because they're playing off this sense of voter dissatisfaction with what's been happening in Europe in the last 5 years. The other problem, I think, is a bigger problem, and that is that the other parties, in order to constrain the growth of the right, take over their policies.
Yeah.
So that you have conservative parties, and actually for that matter centre-left parties too, taking a different line on immigration, say, than they would have done otherwise. And we know that has happened too. So from that perspective, the influence is invisible and existent already.
If you had the opportunity to give one advice to Secretary Kerry, what would it be?
I went into this job so that I don't have to give people advice.
Well, among historians, I don't know, when you guys get together, is there a sense of hope or a sense of doom? Are we doomed?
Well, I don't think there's a kind of guild view. If I think about my colleagues around the department table, there are pessimists and there are optimists. I'm usually an optimist by the standards of my colleagues. I have other people who think that the global warming means that we're all doomed and very soon. So it would depend which historian you talk to.
Well, historians like you should be able, I mean, if history repeats itself, you are the guys who should be able to predict the future.
Absolutely not, thank goodness. History doesn't repeat itself, but history is like I think, studying history is like acquiring a set of tools and figuring out features of a situation that you might have come across before. And then you understand something about the situation. But of course, you're not privy to all the information. So if you start taking advice from a historian, you know you're in a very bad place.
Thank you.